thanks for popping up. We're lucky we have a bunch of people here going to tell you about the future. These are not predictions. They're not guesses. They know exactly how it's going to work out. Trust me, these people know. We should just look back just a second. You know, if I'm thinking about it, in our lifetimes, because most of you are young-ish. I'm looking around. Yeah.
Do we know who anyone is?
We remember like MTV and CDs. That wasn't that long ago, right? Does anyone remember MTV? They just had their video awards last week. Does anyone still watch MTV? Yeah,
They don't show videos on MTV anymore, do they?
I don't know. They had their Video Music Awards last week
They don't show
in Milan.
videos.
Reality shows. Then I don't know. If let's say that was '95, you go 10 years forward, and then it's the iTunes Store and MySpace. Who had a MySpace profile? Yeah. And then wasn't that the time when we said, who's going to need a record label? Everyone can just do it themselves. How easy this will be? Which didn't turn out to be the right predictions. So I think we also said it was the death of the majors. How's that going, huh? But in a weird way, it's right, because they keep shrinking. They're eating each other. So let's start looking forward. If we didn't get it quite right 10 years ago, or 20, certainly the next 10 years won't look like the previous, because I was speaking on a panel the other day, and the previous era, 10 years ago, 2005, Facebook didn't exist, Twitter didn't exist, iPhone didn't exist, app stores didn't exist, Spotify didn't exist, YouTube didn't exist, all the things that we run our business on. So if we're looking forward, that's not what's going to be we're basing our business on. So let's start from that. What's it going to look like? Let's start with the labels, majors, indies. What's it going to look like?
Well, I suppose, seeing as I'm the only person from a record label here, so I'm Ruth Barlow. I work for the Beggars Group, which is quite a big independent group of labels. Certainly for us, I think you can't really look to the future without accepting what's going on now, and I think this year has probably been one of the most exciting years, mainly because no one really knew what the hell was going on. And I think a really interesting statistic for us is, digital. The music business is a digital business now. And I think 2 years ago, if we looked at our digital business, downloads was 70% of our business and streaming was 30%. 2 years later, this literally has flipped. 70% of our digital business is streaming now, 30% are downloads. And I think right now for us, it's very positive, the changes that have happened, because the sort of artists that we attract tend to be the sort of artists that consumers don't mind paying £120 a year to buy and to listen to their albums. Whereas with the majors, I think they've built their businesses on hit singles, a couple of hit singles on an album. They can flog not a shit album, but not an album of 10 hits. And I think that's a really significant change in what's happening in terms of them shrinking, because their business model, it's not sustainable. The amount that they invest in artists, they're not really going to get the immediate hit in terms of revenue that they got before. And I think one of the worries that we need to be wary of, particularly with the majors model, is that they perhaps start seeing music as an accessory to their other services.
Well, let me ask a question about that, because I think right now, again, no value oh, by the way, anything I say is my own opinion, it's not Orchard or Sony's. Just, So if I get somebody tweets and then Sony goes, what the fuck did he say? These are my views. But the majors have been so dominant this last couple of years. When you look at last year in the UK, the top 10 artists, albums, most streamed tracks, down all major labels. When you look across Europe, the first half of this year, Adele doesn't count too recent.
Taylor Swift's an independent artist.
What's that?
Taylor Swift's an independent artist.
On Universal.
Well, she's distributed.
It's a little more than that.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is, we go through these cycles, right? There's always anomalies. Do you feel then we're ready for that tipping point to say the majors are going to lose some of that dominance and there will be the next 10 years of, because as it's consolidated to 3 major labels, do you think now it's going to open it up?
So I led a panel in 2010 in Austin at South by called Top of the Charts in 2015, How Artists Will Become Famous 5 years from now. And the question I put to my panelists was, with Napster and MySpace and this vast democratization and anyone can record and post music, 5 years from now, how many of the top 10 artists on Billboard or any chart will be major label artists? And the kind of general consensus was 7 or 8 of 10, and it might even be more than that now. I think that the big realization is that with this limitless shelf space, you still need a ton of money to break through the clutter, and it's the marketing and how do you stand out, and whether that's terrestrial radio, whether that's mainstream television appearances, award shows, etc. There needs to be some vehicle for money or marketing to break through, and that's really what's stopping a kind of sea change in terms of major indies, in my opinion.
I think the thing that's interesting is that there's this huge gap between the money and the passion. And at one end of the spectrum, you've got money and no soul, right? And at the other end of the spectrum, you've got tons of spirit, passion, enthusiasm, and participation, but fuck all money. And it's a really difficult, it's a very, very wide spectrum. And, if you look at musical instrument sales, they are continuing to grow, and they have continued to grow globally over the last 15, 20 years. If you look at participation in live events and people are turning up to shows, it's just been growing, and people have been prepared to pay more money to go and see artists than ever. So, the recording side of things, which is very capital intensive and requires huge amounts of investment, that's where the crisis is. And, I've always been this enthusiast for anything new. And I've always thought that a new model that would come along or a new startup that would come along would be a great thing, and it'd be exciting, and people invest in it, and there'll be this next sort of wave of ways of doing things. And we've always managed to persuade some people to put some money in and to invest in these new things. And if you look at the record of third parties coming and investing in music over the last 20 years, it's a very sorry story, right?
So what's it going to look like going forward?
So the interesting thing is, every time someone comes along, and Dennis, we'd love to hear your thoughts on this, right? Every time someone comes along and puts a whole load of money into a music business, there's a whole bunch of people in the music business who start laughing up their sleeves and kind of going, oh, well, there comes another sucker who's going to, try it. And if you've ever tried to raise money for, any sort of music industry operation, any business at all, you have to kind of seduce people with the sparkle and the sizzle of rock and roll and of glitz and of artists and of the backstage access that they'll get, And I just think that we need to do a much better job at that than we have done. And maybe we will. We'll see.
My view on it is that you're about to see the sea change, but you couldn't until now. Why? 5 years ago, we used to have discussions with platinum-selling artists, and we had nice conversations, friendly guys, and then at the end of the conversation would be, hey, guys, you offer a great digital solution, you can offer a great service, but at the end of the day, 70% of my sales come from CD sales. So if I have to make a choice, where do I go? I'm going to sign up with Universal or Warner with one of the majors. And so I think for alternative people like us, for a company like Believe, my view is that we only come to a point where we can fully compete. And we see it already. All of the genres of music that are very digital, dance music, urban music, we sign multi-platinum artists. If you look at the French chart this week, we are number 2 Billboard charted as one of our artists, number 5 is one of our artists, and we probably have 5 or 6 artists in the top 50. So we need to replicate this on a global basis. And it's still, I think what has protected the major labels so far is the fact that for a company like us or any company, it is very difficult to replicate a full supply chain, marketing, promotion chain on a global basis. But guess what? From a digital standpoint, a company like us today has 350 staff around the world with large offices. We've got 50% market share on radio for urban music in a country like France. And we're replicating, building this in different territories. And if I had to make a guess, you take a market today where 75%, to your point, is dominated by major labels. But let's not forget that in that 75%, the portion that is locked by the major labels because they control the asset, the copyright, because they have finance production, is very small. And if I had to make a guess, you'll look 10 years down the road, market share of the major labels is going to go below 50%.
They're taping this, you know. We're going to look back. Everyone remember, in 10 years, we're going to look back and see if you're right.
So how many labels will there be?
How many major labels
10 years
will
ago
there
there
be?
were 6.
Yeah.
Now there are 3.
Yeah.
So are you going to add to that number, or are you going to take away from it?
But I think you're going to add to that number, and I think it's probably, the thing is, when you look at creativity from where the creativity is outside of a major record system. It's in the indie label. There's much more diversity of indies across genres of music, across artists, than there's diversity from a creative standpoint inside the major labels. And I think that once you've got alternative for distribution to access the market, that will change things.
But go ahead, Alex.
I was going to tell a quick story that I'm still processing, and maybe people in the audience can help me here, and then my views. So the first story, we launched Next Big Book last year, which is the book version of Next Big Sound. We ingest book publishers, private sales, physical and digital, alongside all the social metrics in a marketing intelligence dashboard. We watched Peter Thiel, the founder of PayPal, the lead investor in Facebook, and a billionaire. He came out with a book last year called 0 to 1. This guy is a digital futurist, is a billionaire, and he signed the most traditional book publisher deal you possibly could with Random House, which is basically the universal of the book publishing world. And when you think about this, he could buy Penguin Random House, keep the 50 best people there, have them working on nothing but releasing his book. And when I think about when someone like that makes a decision, I'm still processing why he did that move and what that actually means for music, books, and the future of content. My personal view is the stitching together of lots of these businesses is still too difficult, from ticketing and recorded and live and all the friction points in between. And as Jeremy was saying, that spectrum from people with the money and investors all the way through to the people with the creativity and the enthusiasm, I think there's a huge opportunity in between. From my perspective, everything has a data element, but if we can present music in a more measurable and approachable way, the streaming and consumption data these are annuities that kind of, once they're released, can recoup investment over time in a measurable way, that there is an opportunity to bridge that gap and more financing to come.
But before you jump in, I want to keep moving this conversation forward, right? And so we know technology has brought us to where we are today. That you said, 2 years ago it was about downloads for you. Now it's about streaming, which is about the web. But then we get these things introduced a few years ago, and now more people access the internet on their mobile phone than they do on computers. This is now the primary listening device, which is why streaming has gone up. But that's the present. So Google Glass, the Apple Watch, didn't exactly work to plan, but it doesn't mean wearables aren't next. What's that going to mean for the music business when people, instead of reaching in your pocket, when it becomes part of you? How's that going to affect what we do? Because all the technology up to it changed how we do business and how we make money.
Body chips?
Head
clouds?
We're coming, wait a minute, we're coming there because implantables are coming.
I mean, you know, Oculus Rift is the obvious thing that people are talking about, right? Which is the 3D heads monitor, and there's about 24 companies making different versions of those, and we're seeing bands making 360-degree videos so that, you know, if you put one of those headsets on, you can actually look around 360 degrees around you and have something that is more of an immersive experience. And I think that is likely to be much more successful in the games world than it is in the music world, but I think it is going to be part of our landscape. And from a technology point of view, there is a sort of an inexorable drive towards high definition, virtualization, virtual reality, so holographic performances. So we've already saw Lollapalooza 3 years ago, Tupac being resurrected, right, and suddenly making an appearance on stage. Some people have commented that most of the audience were so out of their heads that they didn't actually notice that, or they did believe that he'd come back from the dead. It's hard to know what they thought, really. But so there's definitely a trend in that direction, which I think is going to grow and is exciting. And you know, we won't need to get off our heads. We'll just be able to go into these virtual worlds and get excited.
But Ruth, because I want you to pick up on this, because this is not the world of prediction. Virtual reality and wearables are coming.
Well,
so how will we react?
Interestingly, what I was going to say, you know, virtual reality is obviously going to make more of a headway in the gaming world, but there is a company who I met with a couple of weeks ago who are actually doing the 360 gig thing, but they're trialing selling virtual reality tickets to gigs next year from venues like the O2, which is going to be bloody crazy, because at the moment, I tested the virtual reality being a gig thing myself, and it just feels a bit too Star Trek. It's a bit weird, and it's not, you know.
You meant that in a bad way.
Well, if it looked like the holodeck, if it actually looked, if it looked like the holodeck, it would be good. But at the moment, it just feels a bit detached and weird. And
but what was the internet like? You know,
yeah, so
with modems, you have.
But I think the thing is, I don't know if you've ever sat in a room with 5 other people who've all got face masks on. And you all sit around going, wow, this is I mean, I just did that last week, and it was very weird. I mean, you know, it wasn't interacting with anyone sitting next to me. I had no idea. It could have been anybody sitting next to me. And when I took a picture of everybody sitting there with their weird face masks on, and they were all embarrassed and said, please don't show that photograph of me looking.
All right, Alex,
weird.
There's a cool company called BioBeats, and, you know, with all the RFID tags for festivals, there's a really awesome opportunity around heartbeats and rhythms and that sort of thing. So if you are at a club and the DJ is about to come on or switch sets or change the music, getting a literal pulse of the room's heartbeats and using that to set the, you know, BPMs and things is a really awesome application, you know, combining, you know, biometric sensors with music. I don't know, I think some of these are so fringe or strange. That's a cool use case, but I don't know how many concerts like that we'll go to, or if it'll become.
But maybe already, and you're 27?
29.
29.
14.
You look 14, but you're 29. But already you and probably everyone in here is too old, because certainly when we were kids, now we're much older than you, us three, not you. When we were kids, we listened to music communally. We bought a record, went into a room with a bunch of teenagers of the same age, and listened to the album together. I ask teenagers now how they listen to music, and if you tell them I'm in the room as a teenager listening to music with my friends, they think that's the oddest behavior. Music is personal. You put in your earbuds, and it's a personal experience. And then when you're with your friends, you do other things.
Vine was the first network that came around where I was like, that's 6-second clips, that's way too short. No one could possibly enjoy that. So I think eventually it's just going to be 1-second clips implanted in your brain.
Yeah. You'd
every
be like,
second of the day.
1 second, boom, love that. Next.
Hit me again.
Yeah, one more time. All right, done with that. Next. Dennis?
No, putting this in relation to what you said earlier, the short timeline, I remember when I first started in this business 15 years ago, the first line we had in every business plan of every music startup we're looking at was penetration rate of internet access in a household. And I remember early 2000, this was 15% of the population that had low bandwidth access to the internet. And when I created Believe in 2005, the only thing, you mentioned the iPhones didn't exist. The only products we used to sell through mobile networks were ringtones, not out of a business choice but because my high-end Nokia phones had 1 megabyte of memory and downtown Paris 2.5G networks. That was 10 years ago. iPhones were introduced in 2008, 7, 8. 3G, 4G networks, you mentioned it. Streaming is exploding now because we've got 3G, 4G networks. And so my view is, if you look at the past 15 years, the number one driver of the evolution has been technology of the speed. It's been the devices, it's been the network. And the great thing about this conversation now is that now it's fair. And our companies have spent the past 15 years building logistics so that we could get a music track, a music album from the studios into the ears of the listeners on Spotify, Deezer. And yeah, that's exciting, but it's really not the most exciting thing. And I think we haven't spent, a lot of attention has been focused on this, and now we're getting to a point where the attention is going to be focused on how creatively can we use the technology to do 360 videos, very different things from a creative standpoint. I mean, and there's still a lot of work. I'm still amazed by the number of artists that come to us with still thinking, hey, I need to produce a 15-track album. It's like, hey, this is a streaming world. You could put out 1 single, 2 singles, 3 singles, an EP. You don't need to go if that's not your creative form, you don't have to put in an album. You don't need to limit yourselves to a 5-minute track. You can do a 2 hours and 30 minutes track if you wanted to. So I think what's going to be interesting in the next 10 years is how absolutely technology allows and empowers new forms of creativity.
And how will that, because I'm going to come back to that in 1 second, but how will then, if this is what people are listening on, and we're building our businesses towards these, and a big part of it is personalization. You said it, look at the pulse of the people, but you could actually, this can monitor everything on my body now, and wearables will absolutely do that. Is this going to be driven by algorithms then saying, here is exactly the music for you because we know what you like, so we're going to give you some of that, we're going to surprise you with other things, and it's all going to be machine learning delivering content? Or are you going to punch me, Ruth? You're going to don't you?
No,
That's
sorry.
why I put you 2 seats
my
down.
My thinking face sort of looks like an angry face. It's terrible, terrible facet of myself. But no, I'm obviously we benefit from algorithms, but I'm going to be very fluffy here in the sense that I still don't think, and obviously there's been big conversations with Apple and Spotify this year about curatorship and editorializing and all of that sort of stuff. But I still don't think that you can beat friendly recommendations, word of mouth, friends liking things. And I'm not sure, I can be told what it is that I'm supposed to like, but what I dislike about that is the power of something new.
But what if the algorithm recognizes what your friends are liking?
I don't like that future. I'm just going to say it right now. I don't like that future.
You might need to.
Because, I think...
But how about this? It's coming. Again, something that's not a prediction,
Right,
It's
but
more how we're going to respond
what
to
we're
these
also
things.
getting is we are seeing a world where we've got very commercially produced, very narrowly targeted, highly branded artists who are focused on a demographic from the beginning. The band confected, artificially constructed to meet a particular demographic. And then we've also got people way out left field who don't give a damn who their audience is, just play what they want to play, right? I mean, we've got more diversity than we've ever had. And that spectrum, I think, is only going to grow. And I mean, to my mind, if you look at the business model of the majors and what they need to do and the kind of margins they need to achieve, they're going to get closer and closer to brands. The brand involvement in artists and band creation, I think, is going to grow.
Wait a minute, isn't that the 10-year ago conversation that brands would run our business and power
it may well have been 10 years ago.
Did we just talk about it too early and now we're ready for it?
We've talked about a lot of things 10 years ago that we're just about figuring out how to do now. But I think that if you combine it with what you guys were just saying about putting a chip in your brain, then, at the point when we're all, have got our enhanced vision and our hearing is more acute because we've become part cyborg and so half of us are actually partly robot and partly human. And at that point I don't see any reason why the brands shouldn't actually just inhabit parts of our brains, and they'll know what bands we want to listen to and they'll create the band that we want, and that will be that personalized. So that's like, maybe that's 50 years from now.
No.
That's your nightmare.
That's not 50 out.
Oh, you think that's next year?
Listen, cyborgs are already existing. So for those of you from Barcelona must know Neil Harbison, a famous cyborg. Do you guys know him? Check him out, look his TED Talk or whatever. He's amazing. But I remember a couple of years ago, my father-in-law was staying with me in London, and he had a heart attack. And the ambulance comes and they take him away, and that night he had open heart surgery, and they implanted in him a pacemaker that is also connected wirelessly, remotely from anywhere in the world to his doctor, that sends messages back. He sends updates to him. They monitor his heart. He is a cyborg walking around, and we will all gladly become cyborgs, and we will take that same technology. Remember, all this technology, whether it's a book or a record or a computer, these are just interfaces to get something from over here to something to me and in my head. Just interfaces.
I think like everything, it's a balance. So the recommendation engines that cross, people like you also bought this, and then you can see on Amazon when you actually buy them and what you rate the books, and the algorithm gets better at recommending books. And I love leaning on that. I don't think it should be kind of pre-programmatic choices, but I often wish that there was more recommendations coming at me based on what other people like me are doing. When I first moved to New York City 3 years ago, I was like, what does rent normally cost for someone like me? Where do people, where should I look to live? Where do I grocery shop?
Is it scary that maybe there's no one like you? You're like, how come there's
probably
nothing?
Millions of people. So I think it is a balance.
I agree, and it's interesting because you see experiments on both sides. I remember, to your point, a couple of years ago, MXP4 actually did design a helmet that analyzed brainwaves and actually proposed to you suggested playlists based on the analysis of your brainwaves. So I think you have that experiment, and I'm sure you're going to.
But by the way, if you have a wearable, which are earbuds that are connected to this, why do they have to go in one direction? Maybe I can be getting information out and back in.
I tell you, if it is the new freemium. It's like if I decide that actually I really don't want to spend too much money on music, and I'm quite happy for Kit Kat, or Mars or Jack Daniels to prescribe my playlist for me, right? I'm already doing that on Spotify, right? So what's the difference between, a branded, algorithmically defined playlist, that is targeted at Jack Daniels' market, sitting there on Spotify, which I may or may not tune into, and having one that's so much more attuned to what I actually mentally respond to, and when all my vital signs react to a piece of music, the playlist gets tweaked accordingly, and all of that's courtesy of Jack Daniels. All I have to do is drink more of it.
I think that I'm, for instance, willing to give up tons of privacy for better recommendations on Foursquare, of checking in, in the background of my app, everywhere that I go, it knows, follows me around. There's Clear, which is an airport security thing that scans your eyes and your fingerprints, and you get to skip the security line. So you're turning over privacy in exchange for a service. And I think that it should be opt-in, it should be transparent, but that we'll move to a world where there's a lot more optionality like that.
So then a load of us will want to really go off-grid.
Well, listen, you say opt-in, but we've already opted in. And trust me, we're being tracked, whether you know it or not. Everything you do is being tracked. So it's already there. It exists. And by the way, if you use Facebook, all the ads, it's looking exactly what you're doing. You search for something, guess what's going to show up all day the next day? If you search for a flight, boom, there you go.
I was hoping this future was a lot brighter. At the moment, it
This
seems
is
a
the
very
bright
dark
part.
dystopia. I mean, one of the interesting things is to talk generally about the future, and because you're talking about wearable tech and all of the feats that are going forward in technology world, I am quite fascinated by the connectivity that companies like Facebook and Google are experimenting with at the moment. Their Facebook planes and the Google balloons, which I think are going to be absolutely incredible, because if we get back to the music industry, we're quite imperialist about our music industry. It's, we forget about these massive, great big blobs of the world that aren't actually consuming our music, and I think that's a potentially very exciting future.
Well, that's it. It's like you're reading my mind, because I actually put a note on here. What did you slip in? Well played. Well played. No. But so let's think about the BRIC nations: Brazil, Russia, India, China. But we could look at all of Latin America, all of Asia. What will the next 10 years look like for us as this kind of European, North American music industry? One, will we be driving into their territories, or will they be driving into ours? What's that going to look like?
And I think on this part of going back to the past to read the future, I think the MTV example is fascinating. MTV in the 80s built a global media and a global branch that basically created a first layer of global culture for music. And it's almost like that global media has disappeared in the past 10 years. YouTube has killed MTV, but YouTube is not a media. It's essentially a receptacle of recommendations coming from radio, coming from social media. iTunes was never a media, and now you're going into a landscape where Spotify, Apple Music, Deezer are pushing the recommendation to the good thing for the future, human recommendation much further. They're using, obviously, identifying algorithm to identify what content might be popular early on, but still using the old-fashioned recommendation of pushing the artist through a playlist. And I think what's going to be fascinating to me is to see how that plays out in the next 10 years, because you're essentially rebuilding with Spotify, with Apple Music, both something that's both the media and the store at the same time from a music industry perspective. And on a global basis, I mean, I can have access here on Spotify, Apple Music to the entire pretty much music production of Russia or India for the past almost 80 years. Just at my fingertips, and I think
let me ask you about that.
I mean, it's interesting. Although that's the prediction, and I have to say, 10 years ago, I went on record saying, "Gosh, I'm really excited about all." I always say I'm really excited about, because I do get excited. But the thing is that I sort of thought, wow, we're all going to be listening to music from other parts of the world because it's going to be so easy to access it. It's going to be amazing. And actually, if you look at what's happened to repertoire and the success of repertoire globally over the last 20 years, there's been a continual drive towards local repertoire and the consumption of local repertoire in individual. So it's a cultural thing. It's
I thought I saw you in a club dancing the Gangman style once, a couple years ago.
There was that.
Yeah,
but we know that because it's such an anomaly. It's not.
Well, that is the question. Is that going to be the anomaly? Gangman style. You guys remember that?
Gangnam Style.
Does anyone still listen to that? It's a classic.
Millions of people still listen today
yeah.
on YouTube. It still gets millions.
People are
of
still
hits.
discovering it.
Seriously, today.
But is that the anomaly, or are we gonna have a Russian band?
Well, look, if you
Chinese
listen to Eric
band?
Schmidt, if you listen to Eric Schmidt of Google, right? What's Eric Schmidt's target? It's the next 5 billion people on the internet, right? So we've got the first, 2.5. Who are the other 5 going to? And of course, they come from Africa.
But the question is,
from
will
Asia,
they influence us, or are we
what-
going to influence them?
Exactly. And I think if you look at the cultural trend, never mind about Gangnam Style and the odd anomaly, if you look at the cultural trend, what it seems to be is that people in their own countries, and this isn't just about music, this is about nationalism and about culture more generally, people are more and more interested in local and things that are local to them. Then there's this sort of studio layer across the top. So.
Well, that's it. There is always this layer, I think, with Adele, but, One Direction, I know everyone's big fans here. They're English, but they're all over the world, anywhere in the world.
I think you'll have bigger and
Retiring.
bigger global superstars, and I think initially it'll be a lot of Western artists, like it is right now with the Katy Perrys and Rihannas of the world. And then we'll see these breakout hits, regionally that become bigger than they ever possibly could have been before, the connectivity was all stitched together. One thing I was going to say is the kind of interplay between technology running ahead sometimes and, human behavior and consumption. I'll give one quick example would be that I was just thinking about. If the 5 of us got into a car, it would be a great experience if we all have our phones, it knows our listening history, if it could put together a great playlist for our road trip. And that should be relatively easy, except knowing the technology and knowing the rights and the interplay between all of these, that would be an absolute nightmare impossibility to get a single playlist that, pays rights holders appropriately, that plays through. And then we leave Spain and we drive across the border and it just is a disaster. And the rules and
Are you saying this is a bad thing? Because the music industry is loaded with disasters, and that's why we're in it. It keeps it exciting. We don't want a boring industry.
Well, you have a great example here of what's best for the fan and the consumer, and it just being a patchwork of rules and regulations and copyrights and neighboring rights that are not written in a way or an era that allows for something like that as innocent and
So who's failed, the rights holders or the technology? Is the technology exist to stitch it all together, or is it the rights holders can't do this?
I think it's both.
It's probably more of a misunderstanding, isn't it?
Right.
It's like people speaking different languages, which is what you get with music and brands, neighboring rights people, and technology, houses. It's just different languages, different businesses converging.
Even this, what a cultural difference. The response, maybe just a misunderstanding.
I think
so very British of you.
If you look
just
at
a misunderstanding.
100-year copyright law.
Just look at the screen behind us. All I can say is "Sein in Zango Otto da Musica." Does anybody understand that? But Sorry, I don't point at that one.
So, all right, let's kind of look at it differently. So, if we had our MySpace, profiles in the back in the day, and now it's Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and what else do you guys use?
Snapchat.
Periscope, right? Are we going to be using any of these 10 years from now?
Some of them, but not many of them.
Which ones? What do you got your money on?
God, I don't know. I don't think any of them are good enough to feel that well. I just have a hunch that some of them might survive that long. But a bit like cockroaches, Facebook might still just be there, just because it's so...
All right, let me ask a different question. So, if those come under the category of social media, do you think we will keep social media as it is. You know, like we have content. You know, all right, let's look at the layers of the, you know, we have the internet, the web on top of that, then we have all these services and the music goes in it, and on top of that there's social media and other
Plenty of pipes connecting.
Right. Is there going to be another stack on top and that we keep, you know, updating our statuses, or is that fundamentally going to change?
Well, to some extent, social media has already been infiltrated by big business anyway. It almost feels like that's the consciente of that layer. And as nature, you know, as is natural with our businesses, it feels like other things will, you know, develop out that the kids are using that we won't know about. And then, you know, I just think it's like a nation of repeats in a way. Did I actually say anything there? Do you get what I mean?
It's something important, which is because the history of music adoption of technology is that we use it, you know, in music, we tend to adopt new technology because it attracts attention, because it's new and shiny and it differentiates us. You know, and when the web first started, nobody built websites because they thought anyone would actually go and visit a website. They just built websites because they could say, we've got one, and then it would get coverage on TV. Right? That was the reason you did it in 1994, right? But so the music industry likes the new and the shiny, and we tend to be ahead of the curve for lots of reasons, because we're global and all those good reasons.
And what about the music? You know, if we've gone from kind of rock, and then there was the hip hop, and which dominates, and now EDM. What comes after? What's the music going to be like 10 years from now? It's certainly not going to sound like you put on the radio. Like, if you listen to the 80s, it sounds nothing like today. It sounds so 80s.
I don't think you've heard some of the new bands for 2016 yet. They sound very 80s. No, I think, you know, the thing is, all of those genres, they haven't disappeared. They all exist. And, you know, getting back to our global conversation a few minutes ago, and whether we're going to, you know, Western is going to influence all the BRIC countries and all the emerging markets, you know, it's going to be an amalgamation of, and it's going to be like a great big gumbo. If you think about it like New Orleans, in the development of New Orleans and jazz, it's just going to be a new gumbo. It's going to be a new pie, and it's going to be really exciting because, you know, people who genuinely want to, you know, make exciting music will start picking stuff up from, you know, Outer Mongolia. You know, there's going to be, it's just open, isn't it?
And actually, amazingly, there are more people making more new musical instruments today than there have ever been. And they're all, I mean, quite a risky thing to do and quite hard to play. And it's, you know, and they're all digital, so you can make almost anything sound like anything. So you can have a drum that sounds like a guitar and a trumpet that sounds like a keyboard. But, you know, there are people who are continually innovating in that. And every now and then, someone is going to hit on something which will create a sound.
But that's what's interesting. You know, it's not, it's technology has driven everything about our industry, from how we consume it to, you know, how we access things, how we pay for it, but also how we create it. I mean, Jimi Hendrix didn't think of, you know, feedback and all this. Somebody handed him an electric guitar, and he's like, what can I do with this thing? Well, actually, he did it upside down and backward. What can I do with this thing? And he made incredible music, if you like Jimi Hendrix. What does it mean if you give an artist, you know, some electronics? What are they going to create with it? And I think, what is next? You know, not just that, but how do you pair that with all the other technology that's coming? You know, you said virtual reality, wearables, you know.
To some extent, those are the entities that get the music to other people. Obviously, technology plays a huge part in how you make music, and it's, you know, as you said, it's very democratized now. But, you know, there are always going to be music makers, and they'll always blow our minds, or hopefully they'll continue to blow our minds. And how it gets to the consumer, or how people choose to listen to it, you know, that's for the tech heads, because there's always going to be people that have to make music because that's what they need to do.
I just read an awesome book called The Song Machine. Has anyone read that book? It's about, it's a fascinating look at the global pop industry, and out of Sweden, and Dennis Pop and Max Martin and all those guys. And what they were doing was taking, the sounds from America and translating it for Europe in a way that the kind of trance and electronic music and beats, and making it more palatable. And just the delta between those two kind of genres or sounds was not very far, but produced really, interesting music. And thinking about the equivalent of the Max Martin of Africa, of India, of China becomes really interesting, of how do you translate, pop songs into those languages with the instruments that are native or new, or the cultures that are native or new. And then the reverse coming through of, I went to my first Indian wedding a few years ago and just went on this crazy Indian music kick afterwards, because it was so fun and so great. And I think there's just literally millions of opportunities for that to happen, and something's going to resonate and become bigger than ever.
So while the camera is rolling, it is rolling.
Rolling?
The tape.
Rolling.
No, they'll edit, with razor blades. No, so I just want your predictions. Will there be more international music coming to us in the West, or are we just going to build these systems to push more stuff out? Are we going to get more?
In what time frame?
There is.
Let's say, 5 years from now, do you think there'll be a global hit from either Russia, China, India, or Brazil?
Well, there's two different things here, right? Because there's all the music in the world is available to any of us, kind of almost at the touch of a button. Not quite, because it's not all on Spotify or Apple Music, by the way, right? But there's a huge amount of music out there of all kinds. But what's interesting is, what do people listen to in what countries? So the thing that's likely to most make a difference, particularly because of we're such a myopic little universe that we live in called the music industry. Compared with the culture of the world, the thing that we obsess on is so small and so ultimately historically insignificant as to be ridiculous, right? The Beatles are much bigger than the music industry. The Stones are much more significant than the music industry. So, in a way, I think the thing that is interesting is, does demographic changes, does migration, does the arrival of refugees into Europe from other parts of the world, that's what's going to change musical consumption and music and what's visible and what different bands play. It's not what the music industry does. At least I hope not.
Well, I wish, I wish so, but to some extent, I think definitely the fact that you have services like Spotify, Deezer, and others that are global services would make it much easier. And certainly, if you look at the music industry the past 30 years, the way it's traveled the world is very unbalanced. I mean, you take the US. In the US market, 5% of digital music sales come from music that's created outside of the United States. Yet, if you look at Europe, in most countries, it's 30 to 35% comes from the US. So the US has been very powerful in leveraging the investment made in the artists locally and leveraging their success to promote them internationally, much less than Europe, besides some subsets like Adele and others, but which are much less in numbers than the other countries. And I think as you see the music industry rebuilt in some of the territories in Eastern Europe, in Asia, in China, in India becomes much bigger, and rebuild, these industries will have the power to invest more and more probably in the future they have had in the past. So my gut sense would be, yes, you're likely to see more global content coming out of Asia, coming out of these territories than you have had in the past 20 years.
I think this ties back to the earlier question around the major labels and their influence in the music ecosystem. Sony, Warner, and Universal, all headquartered in the US, and as an obnoxious American, I view the American and Western music kind of in the near term being 5 years kind of as prevalent as it has been historically. Certainly as that time horizon goes out, there's huge opportunities with the demographic shifts. Hispanics population in America projected to, be very high in the coming years, is already changing a lot of things. The most liked artist on Facebook globally in the first 6 months of this year is an artist named Nicky Jam, who, if you aren't into Latin music, you don't know. But there's these incredibly
Colombian.
Popular Latin artists. Romeo Santos sold out 2 back-to-back shows at Yankee Stadium, and most people haven't heard of him, and I think that will be more and more what starts to happen, but kind of in the big picture, it'll take a little while.
So the interesting thing about that is those artists that you mentioned that, as you say, most people haven't heard of, but are hugely successful in their communities. Isn't that the reflection of what I was saying before, which is that actually more and more communities feel more and more passionate about their own music, but that this global thing is starting to go away, actually. So, what you just said suggests that, we've all had the experience of going to a show to some band that we thought we discovered on the internet that we didn't realize had this huge fan base and showing up and it's a sellout show, but we didn't know. We thought they were our personal secret, right? I think a lot of people have that experience.
Well, so there's 2 great books, The Long Tail and Blockbusters, that came out kind of a few years apart. And a great exercise to just twist your mind in knots is to read The Long Tail first, which says that each community will have its superstars, but those communities will be more and more fragmented across the world, across genres, across listening and consumption behavior. Blockbusters is the exact opposite theory, which is the hits will become bigger than ever before, and the long tail will disappear, and it won't actually be kind of fragmented communities. It'll be one global community with hits bigger than ever. And my experience has been much more on the latter, the blockbuster framework from the data that we've seen and tracked at Next Big Sound, even though when we first started the company, I fully expected the long tail to play out.
I think you're right, too. I think we're moving in an interesting blockbuster way, which is take it away from music for a second and think about politics. So usually your friends on Facebook have the same political beliefs as you do, left or right. And so all the information you get merely reinforces your existing belief system. You
block that friend on Facebook.
Somebody says something crazy, opposite political belief from you. You're like, what? You believe in that? Unfriend. And so you clear all of that. In the UK last year, or earlier this year, when there was the vote for Scottish independence, every one of my Scottish friends were certain the vote was going one way because they didn't hear one person say otherwise. And the news feed they got, not just their friends' feed, the news they read is their version of it. And then they were shocked the next day, like, how could this be? My entire reality said it was one way, and then it was another. And I think for music, this is going to be an entire reality of this reinforcing and the blockbuster part of it, because as something trends up, this is good now for Adele, as she trends up, it then gets into the lists of people, which reinforces that and makes it bigger and bigger and bigger, and it actually damages the small ones trying to come through, which is an odd position to be in as an indie that you have a blockbuster on one end, yet...
Yes, and the trouble is that you then, that's the polarization that we're experiencing, right? So it's not that the big stars are going to get bigger and bigger, clearly they are. It's just what happens to everything else, because everything else is, probably the rest of the industry is probably 50% worldwide. And but I think that, just picking up on what you were saying before about the sort of the global services of Spotify and of Apple Music. In India, there are 3 streaming services. None of them are Apple Music or Spotify. Savan is the biggest one, right? Well, Savan plays mostly Hindi music and, Bollywood and Indian music. It doesn't play any Western music at all. So the fact that there are global services that we perceive as being global, right, doesn't mean that they are actually global. I mean, going back to your thing about, looking at the world the way we look at it.
We're quite arrogant in the West.
Well, yeah.
Are you going to punch me again?
No,
You're like,
I mean,
how dare you?
No, I think...
No, it's just coming back on the blockbuster thing is, what's interesting is once a blockbuster, categorized as a blockbuster, but very few people ask themselves, where did the blockbuster come from? The number one single Billboard charted we've got now in France is 3 girls, classical music trained, singing a cappella with a violin in the background. It's a blockbuster. Yet 5 months ago, they were totally unknown. They are self-producing, and the question is, yes, there's no doubt that you will have blockbuster faster and blockbuster on a global basis and taking more importance, but will these be manufactured by major labels, or will these be artists that are identified, bubble surfaced, and maybe signed at one point by the major labels or staying on an indie label? I think you're going to see more of those bubbling up and less manufactured.
And more randomly.
And more randomly.
So one of the things that the characteristics of this network environment is this degree to which when something does start to trend, that it then goes really, really fast and it spikes even bigger and bigger than ever. So Harlem Shuffle, Psy, your French a cappella group, so there's a kind of a randomness that happens, and then once it becomes apparent in the social networks that it's trending, these things spike. And that actually is incredibly difficult to manage, predict, legislate for, or do anything around, but we're going to see more and more of that, I think.
But then, just to use another, marketing cliche, but then you're at the firework effect, aren't you? You literally shine really bright and then fall really fast and really heavy, and no one hears about you again.
Well, it depends.
Then it becomes your job to do something about it.
But wait a minute. But there's nothing new in our industry with one-hit wonders,
No.
and honestly, our business has thrived on it, and it sits perfectly well with career artists. So we've had, the, Bob Dylan's and Bruce Springsteen long-term careers, and then I can't name a one-hit wonder because that's kind of inherent in it. You don't remember them, but you remember those songs, and it's part of our...
Gangnam Style?
Gangnam Style. That one I remember. He's a career artist. Don't make sure you get it in the right category. We're almost running out of time. All right, we almost started.
Let's have some questions from the audience.
No. I asked the questions, okay? No, I wasn't going to ask anyone if they had any questions. No, there's no questions from you. You can ask after. Everyone's hanging out. We'll go for a beer later, everybody? Yeah? I think Jeremy's throwing a party in his... What room number are you? The after party. Yeah. Just give him Shane's room number.
Is that Shane's?
All right. The music industry going forward certainly won't look like it is today. It can't, because it never has. And if we're kind of saying, we'll sign an artist, we'll record some music, we'll shoot a music video, and what? Are we, as an industry, preparing for what's next better than we did in the past? Like Blindsided by Napster, one thing after another, we bumbled into the future. Are we getting any better at this? Are we now at the point where we get it and the next 10 years are going to look better? Is it going to be better 10 years from now than it is today? Whatever you define better.
Yes, for sure. I think the legislation and the kind of powers that be are catching up to the speed of change, understand it's not going away, and that it will continue to change. My hope is that the recognition that things change so frequently will be reflected in legislation that isn't kind of passed once and then not revisited for decades or 100 years. I understand it's horribly complex. I think there's huge opportunities for entrepreneurs, whether they're musicians or music technology or others. Any of these kind of areas that we've been touching on today, just finding a lane and becoming obsessed with it for years and years. With Next Big Sound, we're fortunate to find data analytics as a lane that just obsessed our team for 7 years, and you can create kind of a business in any of these lanes if you...
So is that a yes?
Yes.
We're running out of time, and you're like, well, I see a future. No. Is it going to be better? Are we going to sit on this stage 10 years in the future and go, this is the best time to be in the music business?
Yes.
I'd like to think about it in 5 years' time. I think we're entering a period of great equilibrium, which is, a relief after the last 4 years, 5 years, 10 years. We've got to pour our minds to the future and look out, for a couple of problems. Yes or a no? Yes for 5 years, no for 10.
Yes for 5, no for 10.
It depends on who we are.
It doesn't matter.
Who are we? So
it doesn't matter. It's a yes or no question. This isn't like
I've never known who I was.
Philosophical, well, who are we? Why are we here? No, yes or no, is it better?
We are going to be ever better at creating excitement in our own and other people's lives, and it's all about creating excitement in people's lives, and we're just going to be even better at that in 10 years' time.
How fucking lucky are we? You heard the people that predict the future said it's going to be better. That's around. Thank you very much.